Thank you very much, Zeb. Zeb's introduction is quite correct. I was groping for how to answer the question, trying to size up which way the crowd was leaning so that I could take the opposite point of view. Like many people trained in debating, I oftentimes went to a debate without knowing whether I was arguing the pro or con side and had to know both sides of the issue. And that's good training, especially for the World Association of Psychosocial Rehabilitation, where you never know when you're going to be arguing on what sort of issue. But when Michael Mondrianis raised this question back in Bilbao almost 2 years ago, I was in a funny position because at that point I had been arguing for a change in the name for some 20 years. And I found myself more and more leaning in the other direction since then. So I'm going to go over, to some extent, what I think are both sides of the issue. But the reasons usually given for trying to change the name have to do with three issues. One is stigma. The second is misunderstanding of the term, concept, diagnosis, name. And the third is that everybody else is doing it, why don't we? Which is the Joneses article. And let me take each of those in turn. When I started my residency a long time ago, I was paired with someone trained in Europe and in the United States on the same board. And he and I would interview the same person. And at the presentation the following day, his diagnoses were always very different from mine. He never used the term schizophrenia. I always did. Not 100%, but when patients I thought were suffering from the illness had it, I would say so. And because he was a distinguished person, a little older than I was somewhat taken aback and held back. It was my first week, and I wasn't about to step into anything bad. But after a while, I said, Alex, why is it that we disagree so much? We agree on the symptoms, we agree on the course of illness, we agree on practically everything, but not ever on the diagnosis. She said, well, you call people schizophrenic, and that means they'll never get better, they'll deteriorate, and it's an awful death knell. And I said, that's not my view at all. But that was clearly the position he came from. There was a hopeless, chronic illness. That was before the long-term studies were done for monitored elsewhere. And it was a downhill course where no one could recover. Therefore, I am unwilling to use that diagnosis. Now, another group of people argue that the name change is stigmatizing because, like senility, it's become embedded in people's minds, and if senility becomes Alzheimer, it suddenly cleans up its act. So we could destigmatize the concept by calling it Boiler's disease. I mean, I guess he's responsible for this whole mess going back to 1908, or maybe Schneider because of the first-rank symptoms, or maybe Craigwood since he split off schizophrenia from the mood disorders back at the turn of the century, the previous century. But a rose is still a rose is still a rose. And a disaster is still a disaster no matter what governments call it. And I truly believe now that you could call it George or dog or anything you would want to, and it is still going to be the same illness. The second area, that of misunderstanding, well, that everyone misunderstands. The newspaper misuses the word all the time. They say the government is schizophrenic because it does this on the one hand and it does that on the other hand. And we all write letters and we all meet with editorial boards, and they don't ever get the message. So maybe they'll get the message if we change the name. Because Oftentimes it's misused in dual personality, split personality, multiple personality, dissociation, etc., etc., etc. Now, my guess is, no matter what we call it again, but I'll guarantee you that there will still be confusion and still be misuse and still be misunderstanding. That the change is not going to change back. And finally, the area that everybody else is doing. Everything else is changing. We've gone from talking about garbage to talking about solid waste. There's no longer personnel departments, there are human resources departments. There's no homosexuality, there's the gay life. Retardation is now developmental disability. And as I mentioned, senility is now Alzheimer's. The Japanese who did change, and we're going to hear about that later, saw with the renaming a doubling of the designation in 3 years. There's been a great deal of talk in America about torture and what torture has done to the victims and to us, the torturers, over the last several years at Guantanamo and elsewhere. And the principal argument, in addition to the fact that it's immoral, inhumane, and we don't do it, is that it's ineffective. And I would argue, like torture, changing the name without anything else will be equally ineffective. Thank you.